On the morning of July 7th, 1942, as the sun rose over the dense jungles of New Guinea, Allied pilots encountered a mystery in the sky. A strange silhouette, sharp and sleek, appeared above them. The aircraft was unlike anything they had seen before. Its narrow fuselage, metallic sheen, and angled wings seemed to defy the very expectations set by Japan's earlier designs. It didn't look like the bulky, cumbersome Zeros they were accustomed to, nor did it resemble any of the more familiar Allied or Axis aircraft. It was fast, unnervingly fast, and its design seemed to mimic the sleek profiles of German Messerschmitts more than anything from the Pacific Theater. At first, the pilots were unsure what to make of it. The radio chatter exploded with questions, a mix of disbelief and confusion. "What is that?" they called out to each other as they tried to close the gap with the unknown adversary. In the brief moments before engagement, they noted its sudden, lightning-fast dives and its unexpected ability to climb as rapidly as a P-38. It was as though the laws of aerodynamics had been rewritten before their eyes. These weren't the slow, cumbersome fighters they'd learned to expect from the enemy. In the war rooms, intelligence officers scrambled to understand the enigma that had appeared in the skies. They pored over reports from the field, analyzing the erratic yet precise behavior of the new aircraft. What was it? Could it be a new Japanese design, one that would change the balance of power? As pieces of information trickled in, it became clear that this was no ordinary aircraft. The Allies quickly assigned it a code name: Tony. The name, though simple, carried the weight of uncertainty, a reminder of just how little was known about this new threat. And so, the shock settled in. Japan had, it seemed, built something no one had anticipated. A fighter that could not only match the Allies' finest, but perhaps even surpass them. In the skies above New Guinea, the Allies' understanding of the air war had just been irrevocably shifted. But what the pilots didn't know was that this was only the beginning of a new chapter in the Pacific War, a chapter where the rules of engagement would soon change entirely. By the spring of 1943, the tide of war in the Pacific was shifting. The skies, once dominated by the agility of Japan's Zero fighters, were beginning to tilt. Japan was bleeding aircraft and pilots at an alarming rate. The relentless assault of Allied forces, bolstered by industrial might and new, more powerful fighters, had turned the air war on its head. Aircraft like the P-38 Lightning, F-6F Hellcat, and P-47 Thunderbolt, machines of unmatched firepower and speed, spread across the Pacific, overwhelming their adversaries with an industrial edge that Japan could no longer hope to match. In these battles, the Zero's once legendary nimbleness was exposed as a vulnerability. Its lightweight frame, perfect for turning and dogfighting, now failed to hold up against the devastating firepower and speed of its Allied counterparts. The losses over Guadalcanal were staggering. Japanese pilots had to contend with fighters that could outgun them at range and outfly them in terms of sheer speed. The Zero, revered for its elegance in combat, was simply being outclassed. Its limitations were no longer a secret. As the casualty numbers mounted, a growing strategic fear took root in the Japanese high command. They could no longer match the Allies in sheer production numbers. America's factories churned out fighters, bombers, and supplies at a scale Japan could never hope to replicate. For all its might, Japan's industrial base was simply too small, its resources too strained. In the face of this, the answer seemed clear. Japan needed innovation, something new. A fighter that could defy the odds. Something faster, something more capable, something that could once again tip the scales in their favor. It was within this turmoil that a new hope began to take shape. The Ki-61, a fighter designed not only to compete with the latest Allied planes, but to challenge everything that had come before it. Unlike the Zero, the Ki-61 was built with strength in mind, with a more powerful engine and an eye towards speed and survivability. This was no longer a plane designed solely for nimble dogfights. It was something far more dangerous, a symbol of Japan's will to fight on, to adapt, to reinvent itself. But what remained uncertain was whether this innovation could truly turn the tide, or if it was merely another desperate gamble in a war that was already slipping out of Japan's grasp. Inside the humbling halls of Kawasaki, Amidst the noise of industrial progress and the grinding gears of war, a new philosophy was taking root. It was a philosophy that drew from the cold, precise theories of German engineering, ideas that seemed at odds with Japan's historical reliance on light, agile fighters. In this atmosphere, a solitary engineer named Takeo Doi found himself questioning the prevailing dogma of his time. While most Japanese designers were obsessed with agility and the lightweight characteristics that had made the Zero so famous, Doi believed Japan's future in the skies demanded something more. It was time to reject the assumption that nimbleness alone could win a war. Japan, he argued, needed to embrace the principles that had propelled the European fighters to prominence: armor, firepower, and liquid-cooled engines. Doi's vision was far from conventional. His aircraft was to be sleek, yes, but also heavier than anything Japan had produced before. It would possess the resilience of a machine built to endure, not merely dance across the sky. While other engineers focused on lighter, more agile designs, Doi understood the hard truth. Japan's fighters were too fragile. They needed to survive the rigors of combat, not just outmaneuver their foes. His prototype would be radically modern, with an aggressive stance and design elements that would make it stand out in stark contrast to the Japanese aircraft of the time. It was a vision of brute force and efficiency, a fighter meant to stand its ground and dominate the battlefield. When the first test flights began, the results were nothing short of astounding. The aircraft handled like no other plane in Japan's arsenal, powerful, stable, yet nimble in its own right. It was a machine that could endure the punishment of sustained combat and still outpace its adversaries. For Japan's military planners, it was a revelation. They had expected something less. What they saw in Doi's creation was a machine that could challenge the Allies on an entirely new level. In a matter of days, the green light was given for full development. A quiet conviction spread throughout the corridors of Kawasaki and the Japanese command. This aircraft, this radical departure from the past, might just change the course of the war. The sky over the Pacific was about to witness something far more formidable than the Zero. But what they didn't know was that the very concept they had mocked, mass and power, was about to alter the air war in ways they could not yet imagine. At the very heart of the Ki-61 lay a piece of technology foreign to Japan, but vital to its future. The Daimler-Benz DB601A engine, licensed for use by Japan as the He-40, was a breakthrough that promised to revolutionize the Imperial Japanese Air Force's capabilities. Unlike the air-cooled engines traditionally favored by Japanese engineers, this liquid-cooled inline engine was seen as the key to matching the speed and endurance of Western fighters. Its design, sleek and powerful, gave the Ki-61 a significant advantage over anything that had come before it. For Japan, it was the spark that could ignite the fire of innovation. It was a German heart, beating inside a Japanese bird. To accommodate this new engine, Japan's engineers had to rethink the very structure of the aircraft. The long, slender form of the DB601A required a reworked airframe, one that would balance both power and speed without sacrificing stability. The result was a fighter that looked different from anything Japan had ever flown before. The aircraft's streamlined profile, once an afterthought in the world of Japanese engineering, was now crucial to its design. The delicate curves of the airframe hugged the engine's power, allowing the Ki-61 to cut through the skies with an agility that was both graceful and terrifying. When the first flight tests began, the results were startling. The Ki-61 was a revelation, offering exceptional dive speeds and remarkable roll stability, traits that had been sorely missing from Japan's earlier fighters. It could dive with the fury of a predator, then snap out of it with the precise control of a masterful aviator. The aircraft handled with a poise and strength that made it unlike any other plane in Japan's arsenal. It was a machine that demanded respect. With each successful test, the confidence of Japan's engineers and military planners grew. The Ki-61 was no longer a prototype. It had evolved into a serious contender, a fighter that could stand toe-to-toe with the best the Allies had to offer. Internal memos began to circulate comparing it to the likes of the P-38 Lightning and the P-51 Mustang, two of the most feared fighters of the Western Allies. These comparisons, once laughable, now carried weight. Japan had, it seemed, found its answer to the rapidly advancing American air power. The belief began to solidify that the Ki-61 could restore balance to the skies over the Pacific. Japan's once vaunted air superiority, which had been shattered in the wake of heavy losses, might be within reach again. The dream of a fighter capable of challenging the might of the United States seemed less like a fantasy and more like a tangible reality. But what they didn't yet understand was that while the Ki-61 might level the playing field, it would also draw the attention of a new force that would soon redefine the very nature of air combat. Despite the promising signs that the Ki-61 might change the balance of power in the skies, the Japanese Army Air Force remained deeply entrenched in its pre-war ideals. At the heart of these beliefs lay an unwavering commitment to maneuverability, an ideal forged in the battles of the Sino-Japanese War and shaped by the early successes of the Zero. The doctrine of agility, of lightweight aircraft designed for dogfights and sharp turns, had defined Japan's air strategy for years. To many within the Air Force, this was the essence of aerial superiority. Heavy fighters, it was believed, lacked the grace required to dominate the skies. As the Ki-61 neared its full development, internal debates within the military erupted. Should Japan continue to refine its traditional approach of nimbleness, or should it embrace the untested concept of heavier fighters? There was deep resistance to change. Critics of Douai's aircraft insisted that the Ki-61 was too complex, too heavy, and far too foreign in its design. They argued that its robust frame, designed to survive the brutalities of combat, came at the expense of the very principles that had made Japan's early fighters so formidable: speed, agility, and precision. Yet, Douai and his team of engineers were adamant. The world, they argued, had changed. The Allies, they noted, did not fight in close-range dogfights. They fought from long range and high altitude, often with the support of heavy bombers and advanced firepower. The Ki-61 was not meant to be a nimble adversary in the traditional sense. It was meant to endure and strike with devastating force. It was designed for a new kind of warfare where survival and raw power were as important as agility. As the first Ki-61 units saw combat, the early reports from pilots were mixed but increasingly positive. In contrast to the fragile Zeros, the Ki-61 proved itself a sturdy and reliable machine. Pilots praised its firepower, particularly its ability to engage and destroy U.S. bombers with newfound effectiveness. Its ability to absorb hits and stay airborne, to engage with the Allies at long range, began to shift the perspective on the aircraft. No longer just a machine of potential, the Ki-61 was becoming a symbol of Japan's determination to match the technological advancements of the West. Confidence in the aircraft swelled, but so did an undercurrent of arrogance. Japan's military planners began to believe that, at last, they had bridged the technological gap between themselves and the Americans. The belief took hold that the Ki-61, this blend of German engineering and Japanese spirit, had restored the balance in the skies. They no longer saw themselves as lagging behind. Japan's fighters, they believed, were now on par with America's finest. But what they failed to consider was that their new technological edge was not as invincible as they imagined. The war was far from over, and the Allies were not standing still. In the spring of 1943, as the war in the Pacific raged across the skies above New Guinea, the Ki-61 was finally unleashed into combat. For Allied pilots, the appearance of this new fighter was a shock. The sleek, deadly machine seemed to come from nowhere, catching them off guard with its speed and power. It wasn't long before they learned that the Ki-61 was not like anything they had faced before. In the tumultuous skies over New Guinea, it quickly earned a reputation as a formidable opponent, one that could not be underestimated. Unlike Japan's previous fighters, the Ki-61 was not bound by the limits of agility alone. Its speed and durability made it a dangerous adversary at both low and medium altitudes, where many of the fiercest air battles took place. In the heat of combat, the Tony, so named by the Allies, revealed its unique abilities. Where the Zero had once been revered for its maneuverability, it had always struggled to escape once engaged. But the Ki-61 could dive away from Allied fighters, something the Zero could never do. It was a fighter that could disengage with precision, retreating to safety without sacrificing its effectiveness. What truly set the Ki-61 apart was its resilience. The aircraft's thick armor provided its pilots with a level of protection that earlier Japanese fighters lacked. Hits that would have brought down a Zero or a Claude barely scratched the surface of the Ki-61. Pilots quickly realized that they could endure longer engagements, trusting that the aircraft's sturdy frame would keep them in the fight. In these early encounters, the Ki-61's strength and firepower seemed like a glimpse of hope for Japan, a tangible advantage they could wield in their struggle against the Allies. As reports from the front lines began to filter back to Japan, the morale of the squadrons flying the new machine began to rise. Pilots spoke of the Ki-61 with a sense of pride, recounting how it held its ground in dogfights with Allied bombers and fighters alike. Even more astonishing were the claims that the Ki-61 could stand toe-to-toe with the P-38 Lightning, a revered American fighter known for its sheer firepower and versatility. In the minds of the Japanese high command, this was proof that the tide could be turned. The Ki-61 was not just another fighter, it was the key to a renewed offensive, one that could bring the battle to the Allies' doorstep. For a fleeting moment, Japan allowed itself to believe that the scales might once again tip in its favor. The Ki-61, it seemed, could level the playing field. The first victories, though small, were a glimpse of something larger, a possibility that, despite the heavy losses, the war might still be won. But what they didn't yet know was that the Allies were already devising new strategies to counter the Tony's rise. Strategies that would test Japan's resolve in ways they had yet to imagine. The Ki-61 had been conceived as Japan's answer to the growing might of the Allies, an aircraft that could match the best the West had to offer. Yet, beneath its sleek, powerful exterior, lay a vulnerability that would soon prove insurmountable. The He-40 engine, born of Germany's Daimler-Benz DB601A, was a marvel of engineering. But in the unforgiving conditions of the Pacific theater, it would betray its creators in the most tragic way. The tropical heat, the relentless humidity, and the constant salt-laden air of the Pacific made the environment a hostile one for any engine, but the He-40 was especially fragile. Maintenance crews found themselves fighting a never-ending battle against oil leaks, vibrations, and failures in the delicate balance of the engine's many components. In theory, the He-40 should have been a game-changer, giving the Ki-61 its remarkable speed and durability. But the reality on the ground was far different. The engine's intricate cooling systems meant to keep it at peak performance often failed under the sweltering heat. As the planes took to the skies, the toll of constant strain became increasingly evident. Adding to the woes was Japan's chronic shortage of raw materials and the harsh realities of wartime production. Precision machining, a cornerstone of aircraft manufacturing, had become an impossibility. The factories simply did not have the means to produce the parts with the required tolerances. Crankshafts warped, seals failed, and vital spare parts vanished into the fog of war. The once pristine vision of the Ki-61, a sophisticated and powerful machine, became encumbered by the limitations of an industrial base that was stretched too thin. It was a cruel irony. Japan had built a fighter that could stand toe-to-toe with the Allies, but lacked the infrastructure to maintain it. For the pilots who flew the Ki-61, the situation was increasingly dire. They loved the airframe. It was strong, resilient, and could handle the brutal demands of aerial combat. It gave them a fighting chance against American bombers and their escort fighters, something Japan's older aircraft simply could not. Yet, despite the airframe's promise, the engine was the Achilles heel. Pilots began to fear the very power that was supposed to be their advantage. Forced landings became alarmingly frequent, as the He-40's failures left them stranded in hostile terrain, far from the safety of their airfields. Confidence in the Ki-61, once soaring, began to erode. The promise of a modern fighter was being undone by the reality of industrial shortcomings. As the days wore on, the toll of these mechanical failures became more apparent. What had begun as a glimmer of hope for Japan's war effort was slowly being consumed by the very system that had built it. Maintenance crews, exhausted from constant repairs, could do little but watch as their aircraft began to falter in the skies. The pilots, too, began to understand the cruel truth. They had a modern fighter, yes, but it was only as strong as the engine that powered it. And that engine was, at best, unreliable. What was meant to be Japan's technological salvation had become a symbol of their industrial weakness. The war was not just being fought in the skies, it was being fought in the factories, on the assembly lines, and in the supply depots. Japan's inability to produce the necessary parts for its aircraft, to maintain the engines that gave them strength, would be its undoing. The struggle for the Ki-61 had made one thing clear. Japan's military had crafted a fighter that could match the Allies on paper, but the machinery that powered it was destined to fail under the stresses of prolonged war. The question now was whether Japan could adapt fast enough to make the most of its technological innovations, or whether their great leap forward would be undone by the industrial limitations that defined their wartime reality. But what they didn't know was that the weapon they had trusted to change the war was already showing signs of deep cracks, and the Allies were about to capitalize on it. As the war in the Pacific raged on, Japan's leadership found themselves trapped in an agonizing dilemma. The Ki-61, once seen as the solution to their aerial woes, had quickly become both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it was a fighter that could challenge the growing strength of the Allied forces. On the other, its mechanical flaws and fragility under tropical conditions had begun to drain the very morale it had once inspired. The Japanese command, realizing that time was running out, began to push for radical upgrades, desperate to wring every last ounce of potential from the Ki-61. Commanders demanded heavier armament, aiming to give the Tony the kind of firepower necessary to compete with the robust Allied bombers it was now expected to face. They called for reinforced wings to handle the stresses of combat at high speeds and improved fuel systems to ensure that the Ki-61 could fly longer distances without jeopardizing its performance. Engineers, already strained by Japan's industrial limitations, scrambled to meet these demands. The result was a new variant, the Ki-61Y Hei. This version, equipped with 20mm cannons, quickly became the most feared iteration of the Tony. Its power in the air was undeniable. With a more devastating payload, it could tear through the bombers that were now pressing the Japanese defenses. But even as the new model emerged, the fundamental issues that had plagued the Ki-61 from the start remained. The Ha-40 engine, which had given the aircraft its original promise, continued to prove itself unreliable. Engineers worked tirelessly to modify the engine, attempting to increase its durability and fix its various faults, but they were hampered at every turn by material shortages. Japan's industrial base, weakened by years of war and Allied blockades, simply could not produce the precise components needed for the modifications. Crankshafts warped, cooling systems failed, and the spare parts that were desperately needed to keep the planes operational vanished as quickly as they were produced. The Hei-40, despite all attempts to improve it, remained a liability in the long term. Meanwhile, the strategic situation was changing. As B-24 raids intensified across the Pacific, Japan faced a new and brutal challenge. The B-24 Liberator bombers, with their immense payloads and long-range capabilities, demanded a fighter that could operate at higher altitudes, something the Ki-61's engine, now severely strained, was unable to deliver. With its lack of high-altitude performance, the Tony was quickly proving inadequate for the kind of strategic bombing missions that were beginning to take a heavier toll on Japan's air defenses. It was not a matter of if the Ki-61 could intercept. It was a matter of how long it could stay in the air long enough to mount an effective defense. At the same time, Japan's airfields were becoming more overburdened by the daily maintenance demands. With the Ki-61's limited operational capacity, it was not uncommon for airfields to struggle to keep even half of their Tonys airborne at any given time. Pilots and ground crews worked tirelessly, performing repairs under extreme pressure, but the constant need for parts and the rising frequency of engine failures made it clear that the situation was becoming unsustainable. The Tony, for all its potential, was wearing down faster than Japan could repair it. Yet, in the face of these overwhelming challenges, Japan's ace pilots managed to extract extraordinary performance from the Ki-61. Veteran pilots, some of whom had survived the brutal attrition of previous air battles, found new ways to maximize the aircraft's strengths. Their skill and determination allowed the Tony to engage in dogfights with astonishing precision, often punching above its weight despite the technical limitations. These pilots could make the Ki-61 dance in ways that its designers had only dreamed of, leveraging their experience and intuition to turn the aircraft into a weapon of surprising effectiveness. The Ki-61 had become a paradox. In theory, it was a brilliant design, one that could hold its ground against the best Allied aircraft. But in practice, it was a temperamental beast, often falling short of its potential. For every success it achieved, it would falter somewhere else, its engine failing at the critical moment, or its airframe showing signs of wear that could not be ignored. Japan's once celebrated innovation had become an aircraft caught in the tension between brilliance and reality, between what it could have been and what it was. And as the war wore on, it became painfully clear. Japan had built a fighter capable of extraordinary things, but without the industrial might to sustain it. The Ki-61 was doomed to remain a fleeting dream, an example of what could have been if only the necessary support had been there. But what they didn't know was that the very flaws in the Ki-61 would soon be overshadowed by a new force that would alter the war's outcome altogether. What remained to be seen was whether Japan could adapt before it was too late. By the summer of 1944, the war in the Pacific had reached a turning point. Allied bombing raids, once limited in scope, had escalated dramatically, with American bombers now targeting the very heart of Japan's industrial might. The Kawasaki factories, where the Ki-61 was painstakingly assembled, became prime targets. In the skies above, B-29 superfortresses rained bombs on these vital production sites, seeking to cripple Japan's ability to sustain its air war. The relentless bombing campaigns, the most intense Japan had ever faced, soon began to exact a heavy toll on the country's already strained war economy. With each raid, the supply chains that kept the Ki-61 airborne began to collapse. The critical parts needed for the aircraft's maintenance, wing spars, engine blocks, radiators, arrived incomplete or not at all. Japan's once mighty industrial network was in tatters, its factories burning, its infrastructure fractured. Mechanics, unable to rely on a steady stream of replacement parts, began to cannibalize damaged aircraft to keep a few Tonys flying. The ingenuity of the ground crews, once celebrated for their ability to keep these advanced fighters in service, now became a desperate act of survival. The aircraft, once symbols of Japan's technological ambition, were being held together with whatever parts could be salvaged from the wreckage. Pilots, who had once marveled at the Ki-61's promise, now spoke of flying machines that barely resembled the fighter they had trained with. The planes that took to the skies were often a patchwork of mismatched components. An airframe here, an engine from a different model there. Despite this, the Ki-61 continued to fight. Pilots described their aircraft as Frankenstein machines, the line between innovation and improvisation blurring into something more uncertain. And yet, despite the cobbled-together nature of these planes, there was a quiet pride among the pilots. They fought not just for survival but for the spirit of the machine, for what it represented in Japan's broader struggle. Field modifications became commonplace. Some pilots ordered weight reductions, stripping their aircraft of non-essential parts to improve performance, though it often came at the cost of the aircraft's durability. Others turned to experimental paint schemes designed to better conceal the Ki-61 from the watchful eyes of Allied reconnaissance. These modifications, born out of necessity rather than design, were emblematic of Japan's increasingly dire situation. What had once been a symbol of technological advancement now became a canvas for desperation. The Ki-61's promise, the belief that Japan had crafted a fighter that could restore balance to the skies, was now weighed down by the grim reality of Japan's collapsing war economy. The factories, once teeming with workers, now struggled to meet even the most basic production quotas. Resources were depleted, and manpower was stretched thin. The ideal of a modern, sophisticated air force was gradually fading into a memory. What remained was a fleet of aging, damaged, and increasingly unreliable machines. As the situation worsened, it became clear that Japan's ability to keep up with the demands of modern warfare was slipping away. The Ki-61, for all its potential, could not escape the brutal constraints of a war economy pushed to its limits. The aircraft that had once represented Japan's hope of turning the tide was now a symbol of what could have been, an innovation brought low by the very industrial base that had given it life. What was once a fighter that could outclass its foes in battle now struggled simply to stay in the fight. And as the war turned decisively against Japan, the question became not whether the Ki-61 could hold its own, but whether it could even survive in the face of overwhelming Allied might. But what they didn't know was that the weapon they had relied on was soon to be eclipsed by a new threat, one that would forever alter the course of the war in the Pacific. In the spring of 1944, the skies over Japan began to change irrevocably. The United States introduced a new weapon into the air war, a bomber that would soon become the nightmare of the Pacific, the B-29 Superfortress. This massive, high-flying, and heavily armed aircraft was a game-changer. Designed for long-range strategic bombing, it could carry vast payloads over incredible distances, reaching deep into the heart of Japan's industrial and military centers. With its top speed and altitude capabilities, it was virtually untouchable by the existing Japanese fighters. For Japan, this new threat posed a dilemma. The Zero, which had once dominated the skies, was now ill-suited to intercept these high-flying bombers. The aircraft that had been their pride was simply not designed to contend with the B-29's speed or its formidable defensive armament. Japan's existing fighters lacked the range, the speed, and the power necessary to challenge this new enemy at its most dangerous. In desperation, Japan turned to its most advanced fighter, the Ki-61. The decision to deploy the Ki-61, or Tony, for home defense was born from necessity. The aircraft's powerful armament, which had been so effective against the bombers in earlier engagements, was now seen as its greatest asset. Armed with 20mm cannons, the Ki-61 could deliver devastating firepower, exactly what was needed to take on the B-29's heavily armored fuselage. But in the unforgiving skies over Japan, the challenges of using the Tony to defend against the superfortress became all too clear. Pilots were forced to climb at the absolute limits of their engines, often pushing their aircraft to the point of stalling as they struggled to gain altitude. The Ki-61, for all its power, was not built to operate at such high altitudes. Each ascent felt like a battle against the very machinery they trusted to carry them into combat. Despite the limits of the Ki-61's performance, there was a brief, glimmering moment when it seemed as if the aircraft might yet prove itself. Its heavier armament, finally, had a chance to shine. Against the armored B-29s, the Tony's powerful cannons offered a fighting chance. As the B-29s approached, the Japanese pilots, often outnumbered and struggling with mechanical limitations, still made their stand. The first exchanges saw the Tony's heavy firepower inflict damage, tearing through the superfortress's defenses. There was a sense of hope. This was not a fight Japan would lose without a struggle. But reality soon caught up with the dream. The Ki-61's fragile engines, already a source of constant concern, began to break down under the pressure of these intense encounters. Engine failures, which had long been a part of the Ki-61's troubled legacy, now decimated entire squadrons before they even had the chance to engage in full combat. The engines, already prone to overheating and inconsistent performance, could not withstand the sustained effort required to intercept the B-29s. The pilots, despite their skill and determination, found themselves grounded far more often than they were in the air. As the weeks wore on, Japan's commanders came to a painful realization. The Ki-61, despite its promise and firepower, simply could not match the B-29 without a new power plant. The fighter was too heavy, its engine too unreliable, and its performance at high altitudes too inadequate. The B-29, despite Japan's best efforts, seemed unstoppable. What had once been a glimmer of hope for Japan's air defense now appeared to be a doomed effort, the Ki-61 unable to rise to the challenge in the face of technological superiority. The stakes had never been clearer. Japan's reliance on the Ki-61 had reached its limit, and the country's air defenses had come to the harsh understanding that the war could not be won on the wings of outdated designs. The B-29 Superfortress had ushered in a new era of aerial warfare, one that Japan's fighters, no matter how valiantly they fought, could not overcome. But what they didn't know was that the need for a new engine and a new fighter would soon lead Japan to a fateful decision, one that would change the course of the war, but perhaps not in the way they had hoped. As the war raged on in 1945, Japan found itself at a precipice. The once vaunted Ki-61, which had been crafted to challenge the might of the Allies, was now weighed down by the unrelenting failures of its heart, the He-40 engine. The supply lines that had sustained its production had all but collapsed, and the parts needed to keep its engines operational were increasingly scarce. Japan's factories, bombed and broken, could no longer produce the precision components required to repair or replace the faltering engines. The Ki-61, despite its advanced design and deadly potential, had become a symbol of Japan's dwindling industrial capacity, a machine that could no longer live up to its promise. In a desperate bid to salvage what remained of Japan's aerial defenses, engineers proposed a radical solution, a complete overhaul. Rather than continue to struggle with the unreliable He-40, they would replace it entirely. The heart of the Ki-61 would be ripped out and replaced with the Mitsubishi Ha-12-2, a bulky radial engine designed for heavier, more robust aircraft. The radical modification was not just a matter of swapping one engine for another. It required a complete rethinking of the aircraft's design. The airframe, already proven in battle, was adapted to accommodate the new power plant. The result of this transformation was a new fighter entirely, the Ki-100. The first test flights were nothing short of extraordinary. With the He-12-2 engine installed, the Ki-100 demonstrated astonishing reliability, a crucial improvement over its predecessor. The aircraft's performance exceeded expectations. Its maneuverability, once limited by the flawed engine, was now enhanced. The Ki-100 could turn on a dime, maintaining speed and agility in ways that the original Ki-61 had never managed at full capacity. Pilots, who had grown disillusioned with the erratic performance of the Tony, now found themselves with an aircraft they could trust. The Ki-100 was hailed by those who flew it as the finest fighter Japan had produced throughout the entire war. It was the epitome of Japanese engineering, resilient, capable, and precise. For a moment, it seemed as if Japan might yet possess the weapon that could reverse the course of the war. But the irony of the Ki-100's birth was not lost on those who witnessed it. The Tony, once seen as Japan's answer to the Allies' superior air power, had now reached its potential only by stripping out the very engine that had defined it. The He-40, the engine that had been both its strength and its greatest weakness, was now gone. What had once held the Ki-61 back, the very thing that had hindered its potential, was the catalyst for its redemption. The machine that had failed on so many occasions now stood ready to fight at the peak of its power. Yet, in a tragic twist of fate, this moment of triumph came at a time when Japan was already on the verge of collapse. The war was no longer one of innovation. It was a war of survival. The Ki-100's success, while significant, came far too late. Japan's factories were decimated, its airfields overwhelmed, and its resources exhausted. The country was months away from total collapse. Even with the most advanced fighter Japan had ever produced, the tide of war could not be turned. The Allies had already made irreversible advances, and the B-29 raids continued to devastate Japan's cities and infrastructure. The Ki-100, brilliant though it was, could never overcome the broader reality that Japan's military capacity had been broken. For the pilots who flew the Ki-100, there was a grim sense of pride in the machine they now had at their disposal. They had a fighter that could match the best, but they were already outmatched. The battle was no longer about technology, it was about endurance. And Japan's endurance had nearly run its course. The Ki-100's legacy, like Japan's own, became one of what might have been, a fighter capable of greatness, but born at the wrong moment. It was a testament to the brilliance of Japan's engineers, but also a reminder of how innovation alone could not overcome the larger forces of war. But what they didn't know was that while the Ki-100 stood ready to take flight, the world had already changed. A new wave of technology, of strategy, and of firepower was already surging forward, and Japan was helpless to stop it. As 1945 drew to a close, Japan's hopes for a decisive turnaround were all but extinguished. The skies above its embattled islands, once filled with the confident roar of powerful aircraft, now held only the faint echoes of a fading empire. In its final defense, Japan's pilots, the remnants of an air force that had once dominated the Pacific, found themselves flying side by side in their last desperate effort. The Ki-61 and the Ki-100, machines of hope and frustration, were thrust into the final battles above a dying nation. Outnumbered and undersupplied, these aircraft faced the full might of the Allied war machine, particularly the relentless wave of B-29 superfortresses that darkened the sky with their shadows. For the men who flew them, the situation was one of defiance, not expectation. These were not the sleek, strategic fighters they had once imagined. These were aircraft that had seen too much attrition, their parts pieced together from what little remained. Yet, despite it all, the pilots flew with fierce determination, their engines howling with the last vestiges of pride. They intercepted the B-29s in a series of desperate engagements, knowing they were outmatched but unwilling to let their country's fate be sealed without one final stand. In these moments of fury, the latent potential of the Ki-61 and Ki-100 began to show. The heavy firepower of the Ki-61's armament and the nimble agility of the Ki-100 allowed some pilots to break through the formations of the B-29s, cutting down bombers in dramatic displays of courage. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the designs might fulfill their initial promise, an aircraft that could truly challenge the tide of the war. But these successes were few and fleeting. The relentless attrition of war had taken its toll on the Japanese fighter force. Fuel shortages, diminishing spare parts, and the overwhelming bombardment of their airfields gradually turned these small victories into hollow gestures. The reality of Japan's crumbling defenses was undeniable. As the weeks passed, the situation grew bleaker. Airfields, once bustling with activity, were now bombed into craters, their runways rendered useless. Pilots, once confident in their training and aircraft, dwindled in number, their ranks thinned by death or exhaustion. There was little left to sustain the Air Force that had once been the spearhead of Japan's military might. Desperation began to take hold. Some units, out of options, resorted to the ultimate act of sacrifice, suicide ramming tactics. In these final hours, pilots would charge their aircraft directly into Allied bombers, a last-ditch effort to down them, knowing full well they would never return. This brutal tactic, a symbol of Japan's surrender to the inevitable, marked the end of an era. It was not a display of strength, but of the complete erosion of hope. The Pacific Air War, once a place of intense dogfights and technological innovation, had become a slow extinguishing of Japan's fighter force. The Ki-61, the Ki-100, and the men who flew them held on for as long as they could, but even they could not stave off the inevitable. One by one, the fighters fell from the sky, running out of fuel, ammunition, and time. The final remnants of Japan's air defense were crumbling, unable to cope with the overwhelming Allied power. The horizon that had once seemed filled with promise now stretched only towards defeat. In these last battles, the fighters flew until they could fly no more. The Ki-61, its engines sputtering and its wings battered, made its final stand above an empire that was already in its death throes. The planes and the men who piloted them fought valiantly, but it was a battle they could not win. The empire's horizon, once vast with ambition, was now a fading memory. The final mission of these aircraft, no longer symbols of technological brilliance, but of Japan's unyielding will, was not to change the course of the war, but to delay its conclusion. And in the smoke-filled skies over the Pacific, with every Ki-61 and Ki-100 that fell to the earth, the legacy of Japan's Air Force became less about what might have been, and more about the sacrifice of those who fought until the very end. But what they didn't know was that the war was already over for Japan. The sky was darkened not only by the B-29s, but by the immense weight of a lost cause. The fight, though heroic, would not change the outcome. The final chapters were already being written, and the sun was setting on an empire that would never rise again. In the years following the war, military analysts and aviation historians would look back on the Ki-61, the Tony, as one of Japan's most advanced warplanes, an aircraft that, in a different set of circumstances, could have rivaled the best Western fighters. The Tony represented the apex of Japan's attempt to break away from its past reliance on lightweight, maneuver-oriented designs like the Zero. With its sturdy frame, powerful armament, and robust build, the Ki-61 was more than just a fighter. It was the embodiment of a new philosophy in Japanese aviation, one that sought to balance speed, firepower, and durability. It marked a critical turning point in Japan's design approach, a move towards creating an aircraft capable of standing toe-to-toe with the best the world had to offer. In a different industrial environment, the Tony could have had the time to flourish. Had Japan's wartime economy been capable of sustaining the resources needed for mass production and refinement, the Ki-61 might have been the machine that changed the course of local air superiority battles. With its powerful armament and strong airframe, it could have been a true threat to the American and Allied bombers that raided Japan's skies. Its design could have been the cornerstone of a more effective defense strategy, one that might have held the Allied advance at bay for much longer. But in the world that Japan inhabited in 1944, such possibilities were not destined to materialize. The material shortages, the constant bombardment of factories, and the relentless demands of a losing war meant that the Tony's potential remained largely unrealized. The Ki-61's greatest strength was also its greatest flaw, the engine. The Ha-40, though a feat of engineering when it was first conceived, proved to be too delicate for the harsh conditions of wartime production and the unforgiving environments of the Pacific. Engine failures, fuel inefficiencies, and mechanical malfunctions were a constant drain on Japan's ability to deploy the Tony effectively. Had Japan been able to mass-produce a more stable, reliable engine, one that could endure the stress of sustained combat, perhaps the Ki-61 could have shifted the tide in localized air superiority battles. But this, too, was not meant to be. The fundamental flaw in the Tony's design, one that could not be overcome in the face of Japan's industrial constraints, kept it from fulfilling its true potential. In an alternate reality, the Ki-61 might have become the foundation of Japan's air defense, a weapon that could strike fear into the hearts of Allied pilots and bombers. Its versatility, its adaptability, and its latent power could have made it a formidable force in the Pacific. But instead, the Tony remains a symbol of unrealized potential, a testament to what could have been if only Japan's industry and resources had been able to sustain it. It is a machine that embodied the best of Japan's aspirations in aviation, yet ultimately fell short in the face of overwhelming external pressures. The Tony's legacy, then, is one of what might have been, of an aircraft that showed flashes of brilliance but was unable to realize its full potential. It was a fighter that could have stood as a symbol of Japan's ability to adapt, innovate, and challenge the industrial might of the Allies. Instead, it stands as a reminder of the fragility of ambition in wartime, of how even the most well-crafted designs can be undone by the weight of industrial limitations and the unforgiving nature of total war. In many ways, the Ki-61 story mirrors that of Japan itself during the war, a nation that, at its peak, demonstrated incredible ingenuity, only to see its dreams and ambitions slowly undermined by forces beyond its control. The Tony, for all its potential, could not escape the fate that befell Japan's military endeavors, caught between technological aspiration and the brutal realities of a war that no longer allowed for time, resources, or patience. But what they didn't know was that the very concept of the Tony, the blend of power and resilience, would live on in the next generation of fighter designs. In time, the lessons learned from its successes and failures would influence aviation innovations worldwide. The Tony may have been a casualty of its time, but its legacy would quietly shape the future of air combat in ways Japan could not yet foresee. The Ki-61 Tony, as it soared through the skies in the final desperate months of the Pacific War, revealed a painful truth: the limits of ambition in the face of a crumbling industrial capacity. Despite its innovative design and cutting-edge features, it could not escape the fundamental weaknesses that plagued Japan throughout the war: shortages of steel, fuel, and skilled labor. The aircraft, which had once symbolized Japan's technological hopes, now embodied the tragic irony of a nation that had sought to match the industrial might of the Allies, only to be stifled by its inability to sustain such ambitions. Engineering brilliance, while remarkable, cannot survive in a vacuum. The Tony's creation was a triumph of Japanese ingenuity, blending armor, firepower, and speed into an elegant yet formidable machine. But when it came to mass production and the logistics of war, those strengths began to unravel. The aircraft's once promising engine, the He-40, was delicate and prone to failures in the harsh conditions of the Pacific. Parts were often unavailable, and the factories that could have sustained its production were bombed into ruin. In the end, Japan's inability to maintain a steady flow of critical materials and the technical expertise needed to refine the aircraft became its undoing. The Ki-61's legacy was not one of technological failure, but of a nation whose industrial base was unable to keep pace with its aspirations. The fighter's story mirrored Japan's larger war strategy, bold plans undermined by resource constraints. At every turn, Japan attempted to outpace its capabilities, often launching into aggressive offensives and innovations without the means to sustain them. The Ki-61, for all its promise, was no exception. It was a symbol of ambition and foresight, but also of overreach. The aircraft's potential could have shifted the course of air superiority battles in the Pacific, yet it was trapped by the limits of the very industrial system that had brought it into being. In this way, the Tony stood as a poignant metaphor for Japan's broader military strategy, impressive in its ingenuity, but fatally vulnerable to the realities of war. Allied pilots, however, respected the Ki-61 as a rare and dangerous example of Japanese engineering parity. In the few instances when the Tony found its mark, it demonstrated an uncanny ability to outmaneuver and outfight its adversaries. There was no mistaking the craftsmanship in its design. The aircraft could hold its ground against some of the most advanced Allied fighters. It was a fighter built with ambition and precision, a machine that proved Japan's engineers were capable of creating an equal to the best Western designs. But this respect was tempered by the knowledge that, despite its formidable capabilities, the Tony was simply too rare, too unstable, to turn the tide of the war. It was a fleeting glimpse of what might have been, but ultimately its impact was muted by the overwhelming weight of Japan's strategic and industrial failures. Historians have since seen the Ki-61 as an inflection point in Japan's attempt to modernize too late. The aircraft, born in a time of desperation, reflected the country's efforts to adapt to a changing world, a world where technological superiority alone was no longer enough to secure victory. The Ki-61 was a late answer to a question that had already been decided. The Allies' industrial base had long surpassed Japan's in size and strength. The war, in its final stages, was no longer a battle of innovation, but of sustainability and endurance. Technology alone could not win wars. What mattered most was the ability to sustain that technology over time, to build it, maintain it, and deploy it consistently. The legacy of the Ki-61, therefore, became a quiet warning written into post-war doctrine. In the years that followed, military strategists and engineers would recognize that the Tony's design, for all its brilliance, could not alter the course of the war. It would stand as a lesson: the cost of overestimating technological superiority without considering the resources needed to sustain it. The war, in the end, was a testament not to one single innovation, but to the long, grinding effort of sustaining war machines on a scale that Japan could never match. The Tony's story is one of both aspiration and failure. Its design marked a high point of Japanese engineering, but it also exposed the deep fractures in Japan's war economy. What the Tony teaches us is that, while technology can shift the balance of power, it is the capacity to maintain that technology, to fuel it with the necessary resources, that ultimately determines the course of a conflict. The Ki-61 stands not only as a symbol of unrealized potential, but as a sobering reminder that no matter how advanced the weapon, it is only as effective as the infrastructure behind it. But what they didn't know was that the lessons of the Ki-61 would live on, shaping the future of military technology and strategy in ways Japan could not foresee. In the years following Japan's defeat, the Ki-61, like so many other warplanes, was rapidly scrapped. Most of its kind disappeared into the metal furnaces, their bodies crushed into oblivion, a final brutal end to a machine that had once soared with the promise of greatness. As the post-war world shifted and new powers emerged, the legacy of the Tony seemed to fade. The vast majority of its airframes were dismantled, their parts scattered or destroyed, leaving only a handful to survive in the quiet halls of museums. Today, the Ki-61 stands as a rare relic, a historical curiosity seen only in fleeting glimpses, a shadow of what it could have been, frozen in time. For those who had flown it, the memory of the Tony lingered not only in admiration but in a quiet frustration. The pilots who had fought in the skies above the Pacific recalled it with a sense of both pride and regret. It was a machine that had been ahead of its time, a fighter that could have matched its Western counterparts if given the chance to fully realize its potential. They knew its limits, the engine failures, the mechanical fragility, but they also knew its strengths, its firepower, its resilience, its ability to stand firm against overwhelming odds. In those final moments of battle, when the skies were filled with smoke and the roar of engines, the Tony showed its true character. But those moments were fleeting. A brief window of opportunity closed too soon. It was a fighter born out of desperation, and despite its promise, it never had the chance to shine. Engineers, looking back on the Ki-61's design, often reflect on how close it came to true excellence. The aircraft was the product of a nation's last-ditch effort to catch up with the rapidly advancing technologies of the Allies. Its design was bold, even revolutionary in some respects. The integration of armor, firepower, and speed was a vision of the future, one that could have rivaled the finest Western fighters had Japan's industrial infrastructure been able to keep pace. What stood in the way of the Tony's success was not its design, but the very limitations of a country at war. A nation stretched to its breaking point, unable to supply the necessary resources to sustain its creations. The He-40 engine, so critical to the Tony's success, was fragile and inconsistent, and Japan's factories simply could not keep up with the demands of mass production. The engineers, who had pushed the boundaries of what was possible, were left with the bitter knowledge that their creation could never live up to its promise. The Ki-61 in its later years became a peculiar figure in aviation history. Its silhouette, once mistaken for a Messerschmitt, became a symbol of Japan's late attempt to modernize and compete on the world stage. To the casual observer, it was just another fighter among many, its potential obscured by the passage of time. Yet to those who understood its story, the Ki-61 was far more than that. It was the last gasp of a nation trying to defy the inevitable, a machine that embodied both Japan's ingenuity and its tragic limitations. Its design, though initially flawed, captured the essence of wartime innovation under extreme strain, an attempt to craft something superior despite insurmountable odds. In the years that followed, as history moved on and new technologies emerged, the Ki-61 became a symbol of what could have been, a testament to the resilience of Japan's engineers in the face of an industrial nightmare. It was a machine built to challenge a rival, to confront the growing might of the Allied forces in the Pacific. But instead of being a harbinger of victory, it revealed the price of a nation racing against time. Too little, too late. The Tony story was not one of ultimate triumph, but of the harsh realities of war, where even the most brilliant creations are often swallowed up by the relentless tide of history. Yet, the Ki-61 story continues to resonate. It stands not only as a reminder of Japan's struggle, but as a reflection on the nature of innovation itself. In the face of overwhelming adversity, the Ki-61 was a fighter that came close to greatness but never quite reached it. Its legacy is one of both admiration and regret, a symbol of ingenuity pushed to its breaking point. The Tony was a fighter born out of necessity and sacrifice, a machine built to defy the odds, but ultimately constrained by the very circumstances that birthed it. The legacy of the Ki-61 then is one of poignant reflection. In its brief life, it captured the essence of wartime ambition, the desperate drive to adapt, to innovate, and to survive. But as history shows, the price of racing against time is often one of incompletion, of unrealized potential. The fighter that might have changed the course of air combat in the Pacific instead became a symbol of what could have been. A poignant reminder that even the most brilliant creations can be undone by forces beyond control. They built it to challenge a rival. Instead, It revealed the price of a nation racing against time.